Varun and Vanessa, thank you so much for joining me here today to talk about spiritual health and your work. I'm really excited to learn more about your work and how you are potentially engaging the framework.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you. I would love to hear a brief description of what you both do and how you came to this work of being university chaplains and deans.
I am the Associate Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life at USC, a position I've enjoyed for the last 9 years. Varun hired me, likes to say he stole me from Stanford University, but he's been in his own role for 18 years. And so the story of me coming to university chaplaincy is an interesting one, but I would say that it started with my own experience in college with an interfaith dialogue. And so there's no surprise, I am an atheist and a secular humanist who was drawn to religious works, and I followed that passion ever since that interfaith dialogue.
I think for me, similarly, growing up in this country, I had a sense of psychological dislocation. I was the child of Indian immigrants, but I didn't feel American, I didn't feel Indian. I felt like I was neither here nor there. And that hyphen between Indian and American was a barrier. And I really tried to make it a bridge. And one way I did that was to try to find a place I belonged. And what I realized later down the road was that's what it means to be spiritually healthy, to have a place you belong. And now I get to do that with other kids, students who are trying to make sense of their hyphenated identities, trying to meaning make in the world, and ultimately trying to get spiritually healthy, even if they don't have the vocabulary to sort of frame it that way.
Thanks for that introduction. And even invoking spiritual health.
Yeah. That's what we do. That's our brand.
It is. Well, speaking of spiritual health, one of the things that my work has been about has been understanding from a psychological perspective how spirituality and religion can be healthy for people. And at some point, I'd like to talk about when it isn't healthy for people. You are in the same business, so to speak, and I'd be really interested to hear how the spiritual health framework that we're offering may be helpful for your own spiritual care, and if there's any particular of the facets or aspects that are particularly meaningful, or how do those show up in your own spiritual journeys?
Well, for me, when I was reviewing the spiritual health framework, I loved how it really resonated with some of the cultural traditions that I was raised with. I'm a Filipino American who grew up on Guam, and something that came sort of indigenous with our folk religions is this idea of kapwa, that I can only truly be healthy and know myself through others. And so it's relational. It's social. And so when I was looking through this framework, you have that there, that reciprocating love, right? And this idea that if I'm going to be spiritually healthy, I'm going to do it in community. And so that much was clear, whether it's kapwa, whether it's Ubuntu, whether it's interconnectedness. I see that sort of thread of togetherness through many of the world's traditions.
I'd love to ask, in your own life, how do you practice belonging or kapwa?
Yeah, so there's a variety of ways I do that. And so for my own spiritual practice, a lot of my Filipino upbringing had to do with my relationship to the land. And so I live in LA now. And so if I'm going to be intentional about cultivating a relationship with the land, I actually have to seek it out. And so it's in my garden, it's in my office plants, it's in the animals who share my backyard with me, which happens to be pugs and chickens and cats. And so this is a way for me to stay grounded in a very urban space.
Varun, what about for you?
So what I've noticed is that when I talk to young people, especially young people who weren't raised with religion, that's 51% of our incoming students at USC, they may not have been raised with a religious tradition, but when I talk to them about spiritual health, there's something intuitive to them about the idea. And I think that's because they've been raised with an idea of what it means to be mentally healthy, what it means to be physically healthy, what it means to be financially healthy, even what it means to be relationally healthy. And they have frameworks and practices and processes and resources and communities to discuss what that means for them in all those different ways, you know? And they're proactive about it. Kids go to the gym to get healthy, not because they're in crisis, but to sort of avoid crisis. And so when we think about spiritual health, it is intuitive to them. They get a sense of, oh, I kind of have a feeling of what that might mean, but I have no way of sort of operationalizing that or manifesting that. The framework is important because it's a framework, and students who may gravitate towards that idea but might not have a formal religious tradition now have a framework to help them think through it, a way to manifest that in their life. And what I really love about it is that it's all backed by the research. We're finally at a point where we don't have to talk about prayer or gratitude or relational health or awe as an act of faith. There's a science behind all of that. Now we have 20 years of research data behind all of that. And everything in your framework comes right out of the data. I work at a research university. This is what we study. And so the ability to take what science tells us and present it in a way for students that is helpful for them and inspires them in their spiritual journey, there's nothing more important than that, honestly. So thank you for the framework. And there are going to be a lot of people who benefit from it who you will never meet. And that's ultimately, I think, a sign of something successful when it goes out into the zeitgeist and it becomes its own thing and it finds the community that it needs to find.
As an academic who has pastoral inclinations, I always hope that the work, the research, all that is helpful beyond the bounds of my classroom or publications that not necessarily people read a lot.
Yep.
So thank you. You said something that hit me that I had not thought of. When you said young people resonate with like spiritual health.
Yep.
That's really true. Like our young people today have been so taught to reflect about their mental health, their relational health, that spiritual health is kind of natural to them. But that's not necessarily the case for like older populations. So like, why would I think about spiritual health? It's obedience. It's something I've done all my life, or I do this, but they don't necessarily think about how it contributes to their well-being. Varun, in another conversation, you were mentioning how when people go through something extraordinarily terrible or wonderful, how their well-being might fluctuate, but they reset to where they were. I'd love to hear you reflect on that, and then in the context of being a chaplain, like where that shows up with young people, like crisis or formation.
Yeah, there's a study, I think from 1978, that says something like, if you have the best thing that ever happened to you, and in this case it was winning the lottery, or the worst thing that ever happened to you, in this case it was becoming paralyzed, within 12 to 18 months, you're gonna be at the same baseline you were emotionally before that thing happened to you. And so what I think the study suggests is what's really important is your baseline. It's not in chasing the highs and lows of what happens to you in the world, but finding the baseline to encounter the highs and lows of what happens to you in the world. I found that to be the case when my family and I were displaced by the Palisades fire. That was one of the worst things that happened to us, and it was really hard to see a way out of that. But just recently, about a few weeks ago, we had the 1-year anniversary of the fires, and I realized we were also looking forward. We were emotionally back to that baseline. That very study that I kept citing for most of my career, I lived, and I saw that to be the case. What helped us get through the fires, and I think what helps us get back to baseline, is having a spiritual approach to a problem that we might be having. For me, coming out of the fires, it was a very simple thing. It was just changing one word. For the first 6 months, I kept thinking, why is this happening to me? As soon as I began to think about why is this happening for me, everything opened up. And instead of being the passenger in a car that was taking me where it wanted to, I was the driver taking myself where I needed to go. And I could help my kids make meaning out of something that I couldn't find meaning in, right? It was a more proactive way of approaching things. So I think having a spiritual health approach to anything is a proactive approach. It's understanding what you control versus what you don't control. I didn't control the fire, but I control my reaction to that fire. And if I'm gonna cede what I can control over what I can't control, then I'm giving my agency over to anxiety. And so many students who have so much that keeps them up at night are looking for something that gets them up in the morning. It's the anxiety that keeps us up at night based on the things we can't control, which are mostly external to us. It's purpose that gets us up in the morning, which is based on things we can control, which is mostly internal to us. And I think ultimately what spiritual health means is knowing what you can control and owning it.
Vanessa, I'd love to ask you, like in your life or work as a chaplain, how do you help promote spiritual health or spiritual formation of students in a very pluralistic context? So they are in a place like Varun's talking about of having a sense of purpose to get up or a sense of spiritual health.
Well, at USC, we have such a large student population, and so we only get a glimpse of it, maybe a few thousand a year. And every student is on their own journey, and I think the gift we give them is receiving them as the unique gift that they are, and helping them to explore the gifts that they bring from their religious traditions, from their family traditions, from their cultural heritage. But we also create a space where they can meet people who are different than them, right? Where else are you going to do that but LA, but at USC, but at a university religious center that has everyone from atheists to Zoroastrians? That is happening in our space.
A to Z.
I did that math or letters.
Right. And so I provide spiritual care on a regular basis to students of a great variety of backgrounds, both religious and non-religious. But then they go out into this religious center and they're encountering these differences, which also helps them evolve in their own spiritual journeys. And so we provide programs for all our Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and other groups. But most of our programs are asking just life's big questions, trying to elicit experiences that help them think about what is truly meaningful to them.
So much at the heart of the spiritual health framework is meaning making. And I see the different facets as ways people make meaning, whether it's their experience of transcendence or understanding or beliefs about transcendence or their community. I'd be curious to know, from your perspective in working with students, are there aspects of the facets that perhaps you hadn't thought of or were surprising or that might be particularly helpful in campus ministry work?
Yeah, well, certainly within the framework, it reminded me actually of some of this intersectional work that's looking at just the variety of ways we are socialized and the stories we tell ourselves as well as what we tell about each other. And so when you think about the spiritual health aspect, there's so many different facets that you can draw on. So for me, for example, as an atheist, a lot of times I had this deficit mindset like, oh, I'm not religious, so I don't have any of these gifts. I'm not showing up with any of these gifts. But what I've learned as a chaplain over, more than a decade in this role is that actually, as a Filipina, as a Guamanian, as someone living in LA, as someone who was a dancer, there are all these spiritual gifts that I have been receiving through my social groups, but also through my spiritual practices. And so that's what I try to elicit from my students so that they can recognize those gifts.
That's really helpful. Because you work with university students, both of you, identity is such a formative and developmental task that they're working with and forging purpose. I loved how you just named the intersectionality of so many aspects of identity. But then you hinted at practices that have enabled you to formulate your identity. What do you think are practices, especially in a multi-faith secular context or pluralistic context, that you have seen young people engage in that help them form a healthy form of spiritual identity?
One of the things I found really helpful in talking to students about spiritual health and reclaiming a sense of identity or writing their identity is storytelling. We're on a campus with amazing storytellers. We have great filmmakers and playwrights and poets and musicians and others who are telling stories for the world. But what I tell our students is that we're all storytellers and we all tell stories about our life and we become the stories that we tell about our life. I can't find anything the same about me if I look across my life at ages 10, 20, 30, 40. Unfortunately for my wife, I can keep going with those numbers. Except for one thing, which is I am the story that I tell myself that I am at every one of those ages. And so I keep coming back to Joseph Campbell and the idea of the hero's journey, the monomyth that connects us as human beings, that we're all sort of these heroes in our own life's journey, that what it means to live a rich life is to live a life that also has a lot of conflict, because that's what makes a story interesting. There is no interesting story if the protagonist doesn't change. So even as students are going through change, which might feel really tough for them, well, that's what it means to live a rich and interesting story, and they want to live a rich and interesting story. And what I remind students is that at a research university, we assume that we describe our reality, that if we have the right words, then we can describe the phenomenon, whether it's in science or history or economics. It's all about getting the right words to describe the right thing. But when it comes to our own stories, our words aren't describing our reality, our words are creating our reality. And so what we tell ourselves becomes the story that we are. And I want students to feel empowered, especially at the ages of 18 to 26, which I think are the most spiritually rich time in one's life to ask and answer the ultimate questions of meaning and purpose. I really want them to feel empowered to tell a story where their words become the reality that they want to live by. And so for us, because we are in a city and on a campus where storytelling is already so popular, to be able to use that idea and turn it inward so that all of us can be sort of the authors and the protagonists simultaneously of the story that we're telling, I feel like that can be liberating for students to feel as though that they can be the authors of the story they want to live as opposed to the recipients of the story that they might have been handed.
And developmentally, it's very excellent timing for university students to be thinking of, this is what I've been handed, and this is where I'm going to move forward with it. And, Vanessa, from your perspective, have you seen practices or do you have tools for working with students?
I think that's one of the gifts I received from Catholicism, in that it was high church, that it had the smells and the bells, the incense, the waters, all these elements, right? But then, as I transitioned into my atheist perspective, I lost this ability to enjoy ritual until I realized I had the power of ritual in my own hands. And so in a spiritual care session with a student, I'm asking students what rituals resonated with them as they were growing up and how they might be recreated in this space on a college campus that is foreign to them. Because we want them to be in a comfortable space in their dorm room or even in how they cultivate what's going on their desk while they're studying, right? And so it could be altar building, but it could also be the way in which they create a ritual around their bed. They're going to bed, right? Or putting their phone to bed. Simple acts like this. And in terms of other spiritual practices, I would say one of the most popular things amongst young adults has been mindful USC, mindfulness practices. We've created ways for them to be more thoughtful and more present to different activities they're doing throughout their day. And so even a mindfulness practice has been truly beneficial to many students I've met.
A topic that keeps surfacing in my conversations with chaplains, especially university chaplains, is actually the relationship between the chaplaincy office and student wellness or the mental health services and how they're so interrelated. And in these days, given the rise of those who affiliate as spiritual but not religious, often students are not turning as much to the chaplaincy office or the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, but going to student wellness. And it seems like at USC, you guys have created your office, an environment, or have a sense of hospitality and welcomeness in such a way that so many students feel welcome. And those three aspects of life feel very connected. And I'm curious how you've done that, or am I reading that right, or what's the relationship between student health and spiritual health in your office?
The great thing at our university is that we have a close relationship with counseling and mental health. And so not only do I, as a chaplain, refer students to counseling and mental health because it's very apparent sometimes when a student may be trying to do some spiritual bypassing or trying to do some self-healing that would benefit from additional care. But we have professionals at the Counseling and Mental Health Center who have been trained at Fuller or in other religious institutions, Muslim, Christian, and even Buddhist practitioners who also are aware that they can refer them to religious life, recognizing that they too would benefit from that added layer of spiritual care.
Oh, that's great.
I think this is what surprised us. We have embedded counselors in our chaplains meetings so we can do referrals because, like Vanessa said, when a student is in crisis, that whole student is in crisis. That's spiritual, that's emotional, that's mental, that can be financial, that can be academic. We can build support teams that are confidential that still work together to support the whole student in crisis, right? And so when we started training our chaplains to refer people over to the mental health teams, we did trainings around red flags and things to look for. But what surprised us is once we started doing that, how many referrals we got back. Because even non-religious students, when they go into crisis, sometimes the language of religion emerges or the archetype or architecture of religion emerges in ways that the mental health counselors recognized would be helpful for students to come to chaplaincy. But generally, I would say in this day and age where 51% of our students come to USC not affiliated with religion compared to 5% of their grandparents, this is a significant shift in American religious history over 2 generations. This is the story of religion in America right now. Our students come in pretty therapy literate, but not chaplain literate. I don't know if our students even know what a chaplain is, but they know what a therapist is. And so some part of it is also socializing or bringing forward an idea of a resource that they might need without even knowing what it is. There are very few resources on campus that are confidential too. A chaplain is one of them, right? And so oftentimes students don't need a remedy. They just need a space to be seen and heard. That's what chaplains do best, is create spaces for people to be seen and heard. But we have to be more aware and do more outreach of just explaining who we are than we did 20 years ago. People would know who we were 20 years ago.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. On that note, the whole trend of affiliating as spiritual but not religious is obviously increasing. What words of advice might you have for religious chaplains, or those that affiliate more as religious, or even those in ministry that are more religious or identified with one tradition? What advice would you have for them to be able to engage those that are spiritual but don't affiliate, that have rejected religion or don't know religion, as is often the case these days? Like, what's the sticky point?
As you heard, a lot of young adults are no longer affiliated with religious institutions, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're not spiritual. What I'm learning is there's not a lot of religious literacy amongst young adults. And so a lot of times our Interfaith Council ends up being a space where those who are seeking to learn more about religions can explore it with their peers. And that's a really safe space to be doing that with other college students. But for religious professionals who are seeing this landscape of secular or unaffiliated folks, I think it means we have to use a new language. And a lot of times that means learning the language from our students. And so me being secular, sometimes words like transcendence and spiritual, they mean something else, I think, to a lot of people. But for me, those may not be the words that help me access these sensations of awe or other things that I find meaningful. And so I think we're in a place where we're actually learning from this next generation, Gen Z, Gen A, about the ways in which they understand their world.
Vanessa, I'm so glad you brought up the point of language, because I do think there's such a transition. There is so religious liturgy, but I meant literacy, is in decline. What language do you find helpful for engaging students, or in your own life, when you're asking questions about ultimate meaning or trying to access the spiritual sensations that you just referenced? How do you describe that? What language is helpful for you?
Well, I think the skill of a chaplain is actually being present to whoever's in the chair. And so part of that chaplaincy role is learning that language that this individual is sharing with you in that moment. So not only are you listening intensely for these cues as to what they find meaningful, but then you can repeat back to them that sort of language, but also have them go more deeply into it. And so, atheists may not like the word spiritual because it feels very religious, but they no doubt experience awe at this amazing universe that we have, right? And so it's a matter of finding that language with each person who is seeking spiritual care.
I think if chaplains take as a presupposition, which most chaplains do, the sort of idea that was popularized by the French theologian Desjardins, that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. If we take that seriously, then that means that all of us are spiritual. That doesn't mean all of us are religious. Religion can be a way to be spiritual, but at our core, we're all spiritual, and that we all need spiritual nourishment in the way that we all need, air and water and shelter, et cetera. Then we can find, I think, a secular spiritual language that helps us convey that without maybe the same kinds of connotations that traditionally religious language has. That's, I think, what Vanessa's talking about. But we can also repurpose traditionally religious language in ways that make sense for students. So for me, if I'm asking students about their spiritual health, what I might ask them is, what is sacred to you? You don't have to be religious or theistic to have something that's sacred to you, especially when I say, well, maybe it's football, maybe it's hip hop, maybe it's your family. Surely you have something that's sacred to you. Now suddenly you've given them permission to use the language of the sacred in a way that they never had permission before. And maybe that word sacred can mean something to them that would help them get to spiritual health. That won't help them get to religion per se, but to spiritual health. And ultimately, I feel as though religion is a language that has been constructed and consumed by humans to become spiritually healthy. But it's not the only language to become spiritually healthy. We're just in a transition period where many people are unaffiliated with religion, and we're trying to figure out where we move from there. But if the top of the mountain is spiritual health, then there are many ways to the top of the mountain. Right?
It's really helpful. I really appreciate the emphasis on attuning to the young person. And then though when you're trying to do programming for a broader constituency, like Varun or either of you when you're giving addresses to a multi-faith, pluralistic group, what is language that you draw on to invoke and touch into the spiritual lives of people?
I try to get to whatever we might call purpose in different languages. You know, we may say purpose, for Hindus it's dharma, for, you know, in Japan they say ikigai, in France it's raison d'être. It's the idea of what is your reason for being. There are many different ways to get to that idea. What is sacred to you? What gets you up in the morning? How do you make purpose? What is your story? They're all kind of sort of getting at that core thing, which is how do you live a purpose-driven life? I think religion is about living a purpose-driven life. The science around living a purpose-driven life is very clear. You're gonna be much happier at work, you're gonna be much happier at home, you could even live 7 years longer. That's what the gerontologists tell us. And so there are all sorts of ways in which having purpose is a protective factor. When students aren't raised with religion, they may have trouble finding a framework that gets them to purpose, but our birthright as humans is purpose. And so the spiritual health framework can be, I think, especially helpful for people who don't have a religious framework. But like I said, as human beings, we're all spiritual. We're just having a human experience, but we're fundamentally spiritual. We're meaning-making people, and we need sort of ways to make meaning in our life. It's exciting that there's language around spirituality and science that's evolved over the last 25 years, where we can have conversations that impact 50,000 people on our campus, not just the 25,000 who self-identify as religious.
One of the things that, you know, my own, I think, spiritual faith journey is I have found it such an invitation, like, toward purpose, where so much of, like, mental health and other things are, like, healing symptoms. And so it really, faith, spirituality, religion can offer people a way forward. And I love, Varun, I've had the opportunity to hear you speak in many contexts. I'm eavesdropping on you online, you know, how you invite young people into the journey of meaning making. But I'm wondering, like, does USC, does your office have any programs or practices that students might engage in, like when they're seeking meaning, or they're like, I don't have a purpose, or how do you encourage them to grow in their purpose?
One example of a program we're doing this semester is Spiritual Tools for Modern Living. And this is based off Rainn Wilson's books, Soul Boom. But what happened in that book is that he gives you all these activities in which to explore. But that's just an invitation to come into the room and have spiritual conversations. Because guess what happens when we're doing a vision board, or we're doing our spiritual playlist, or we're doing just these different activities? It's the conversation and connection that's actually eliciting these positive emotions, right, that are really gonna stay with these students. And so spiritual tools for modern living, as we explore the great variety of spiritual tools in this world, but we're bringing them into community.
It feels like the real opportunity for this generation is just getting them together. You know, relational health is one of the most important pillars in this, because they're going through an epidemic of loneliness. This is, you know, we work on a campus where we have 50,000 people representing 140 different countries. You would think this would be the least lonely place in the world, but it can feel like the most lonely place for a lot of students. What we noticed after the pandemic is that a generation that had already been torn apart by with their social media algorithms went through a even more intense period of isolation. And when they came out of it, they really wanted to be in small community. They didn't want to be at the big events with the celebrities. They wanted to be in small communities where they could see each other and hear each other. Half of what we do is just trying to bring students together. If we can bring people together over something, over a shared idea, over a meal, over an activity, over a service project, over a ritual, over a worship service, over a vigil, then the students will find each other, and that's the real work. The real work is the meeting and knowing of each other. And that's the work that we need in the world right now. I became a professor of religion because I thought that if I taught people about the religions of the world, I could help dispel the stereotypes they might have inherited. And I think that's true. Vanessa and I teach a very popular religion class with 200 students in it, and we do that work. But what's more important is the work that we do as chaplains, because what the data tells us is that learning about someone new can be helpful, but what really changes your heart and mind is knowing someone new. It's really hard to hate the other when you love the other. And the entire university fits in that way. You can meet someone from a different faith perspective or identity marker or region or what have you, life experience, in the dorms, in study abroad, at the newspaper, like in sports, in the fraternities, in religious life, et cetera. And so we try to maximize these intimate community moments where people can be seen and heard. And that goes to the relational health part of spiritual health, which I think for this generation may be the most important right now. As a result, what we have found is something very surprising. Even though we are in an era where every year there are fewer and fewer people who are religiously affiliated coming to USC. 18 years ago when I started, a third of our students weren't affiliated. Now, half of our students are affiliated. This number will keep going up. And yet, I can honestly say this is the golden age of religious life at USC. We have more students at Shabbat services than we ever have. We have more students at our masses than we ever have. We have more students in meditation, at Diwali, in our gospel choir, in our iftar dinners. Like at every gathering, we have more students than we ever have. Students want to be together. This is a way for them to be together. We're giving them permission to be together. And what I noticed is 20 years ago, students were walking away from a religion that they were raised with that they felt had sort of failed to live up to its own values. Now students are walking towards a religion they were never raised with.
Isn't that fascinating?
And so they're coming out from really they're spiritually curious. Yeah. They're not running from something. They're running towards something. And I think that's why in the age of disaffiliation, we're experiencing a golden age. I never saw that coming.
That's really amazing. I wanted to ask you, some of the research, I want to ask you about lack of spiritual health, of when spirituality is not healthy. And there's a growing body of research that shows that, like, when people disaffiliate, there's some consequences that come with that. You might feel like a lack of community. You might be challenged in meaninglessness because you are now in a place where you get to forge those things for your own. But there's a lot of dissonance and disconnection with your past. I'm curious, in ways you've experienced spirituality and or religion not being healthy. Like you're saying, people have left, but they're joining on their own terms.
If part of what we think spiritual health means is to have strong relational health, then not having strong relational health, leads us to a spiritually unhealthy place. We can think of spiritually healthy individuals, but we can think of spiritually healthy organizations too. And we have a lot of spiritually unhealthy organizations. I would even go so far as to say that the universities aren't the most spiritually healthy places. Universities can be sites of real moral injury, right? Universities can be part of the problems to the world, even though they purport to be part of the solution to the world. That's why when universities fail, it's like when religion fails. It hurts you even more than when a corporation fails, because these are mission-driven, not-for-profit organizations that are supposed to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So we see that quite a bit. We work at a university. They're not perfect places. We try to take a few steps forward every year, but sometimes we take a few steps back, and that becomes really hard. It becomes really hard to be the chaplain of an organization that's causing people harm or pain, and to be a representative of that organization, right? I had a dark night of my soul when we went through some really serious crises at the university that were, I would say, that the university was complicit in. And I talked to my friend who was a Catholic priest at the time, and I said, why didn't you walk away from the Catholic Church after the child abuse scandals? And why shouldn't I walk away from USC? And he said the reason he didn't, and the reason ultimately I didn't, is because he said, I believe in the mission of the church. And the mission never failed. The people failed. But we need to live for something bigger than just imperfect people. We need to live for a perfect mission. The mission of the University of Southern California is the central development of the human mind and spirit. In the first sentence of the mission statement is the development of the spirit, right? And so when I was hired, the president said, I wrote that for you. I think of the spiritual life of our students as, just as important as anything else that they're doing here. And that's what I want for them, to be spiritually healthy. He said this to me in 2008. And so the mission of the university has never failed me. The students haven't either. So I do have something to get up for every morning, but you have to be mission-oriented. And so when an organization is no longer spiritually healthy, I think you have to revisit the mission of that organization, the DNA, and instead of throwing out the organization with its imperfections, recalibrate your sort of compass towards fulfilling the mission and getting as close to that as you can.
Varun, a lot of what you have brought up has a lot to do with morality and people's sense of ethics. My research background actually started in moral and character development, and often feel like when we're talking about thriving or spiritual health, the moral life has a lot to do with the long-term gain. Love, positive emotions, fuels us in our journey, absolutely essential. But in terms of like directing our journey, like towards purpose or having values that help us get there, I'm just curious like how the moral life or ethical life shows up in your work at USC and how young people today, who are not necessarily coming from ethical traditions anymore, get their sense of morality.
Well, I think one of the challenges of the loss of a monoculture, when I was growing up, we were all watching the same stuff, we were all listening to the same news, we all had a common set of facts. When we had a monoculture, we had a shared moral imagination. I fear that we're in losing our monoculture and in becoming so factionalized, polarized, and algorithmized, we're losing that shared moral imagination that we had, or shared moral vocabulary. I don't know where our students are getting their moral compass from, because we're asking them to be better than the people they see in the world. We're asking them to be the kind of leaders that we don't even see in our own government, quite frankly. My sense is that we used to look up to people we saw, but students have immense distrust with what they see. There's a lot of distrust right now with institutions in the United States with young people. There's a distrust of financial institutions. That's why cryptocurrency is $1 trillion industry. It's mostly driven by young people. There's distrust of educational institutions. That's why we get petitions every week, even though we never used to get them 20 years ago. There's distrust of political institutions. That's why students are more and more politically independent. There's distrust of religious institutions. That's why 51% are not affiliated with religion. But if you don't have trust, it's hard to feel like you're thriving. If you don't have trust, it's hard to feel like you belong. If you don't have trust, it's hard to feel like you're spiritually healthy. So I think this is our challenge, really, is to come to a place where, in the absence of a predominant religious culture, and in the presence of algorithms that are trying to drive us apart, and in the absence of examples of what strong and courageous moral leadership look like in the world, how are we coaching our students up to be the thing that they don't see anywhere else? That's a tough one.
That's a tough one. Yeah, Vanessa, I'm curious, like from your vantage, how that shows up in your work as a chaplain.
Yeah, and actually, if I can also tie this to the previous question around spiritual health and how it can also have a negative side. In my own experience, I knew from a young age I was no longer Catholic in belief. But as you said, to renounce the Catholic Church and belief would be renouncing like what felt to me as my whole Filipino community, my family. And so I had to redefine for myself what it is to be a Filipina if I'm not Catholic, because they are so intertwined. And so I think Varun is right. All of us are receiving some really divisive messages online and from other sites. And it does require us to be really reflective as to what is truly our purpose, our guide, our values, and to have a practice that helps ground us in that. Because if we continue to be faced with all the vitriol that is going on in our world, it will tear us apart. And so by having spiritual health as a priority, you can identify those spiritual practices, skills, gifts that are really going to serve you in the long term.
I used to think spiritual health was an aspiration, but now spiritual health feels like an act of defiance. An act of defiance against a world that wants us burnt out, anxious, outraged, at each other's throats, hopeless, afraid.
I agree. I think spirituality invites us into the core of our humanity. And so when we give people permission or pathways to pursue healthy spirituality, I think we become more fully alive and ultimately connected if it's done right. And when you were talking about narratives earlier, one of the soapboxes I like to get into is encouraging people to have inclusive narratives. So when we're working across worldview, ideological, religious differences, like how do we have narratives that are inclusive and respectful and compassionate of each other? And then how do we enable people to become fully alive in their own spiritual values and faith so that we can be a better humanity? Vanessa, I'd love to ask you two things.
Sure.
One, What are spiritual practices that ground you? This is a moment where you guys work in high service, you're giving a lot. What grounds you in this crazy world that we're living in?
Yeah, as I alluded to earlier, the natural world very much is a way in which I find grounding. And so if you come to my work office, as well as my home office, there are plants everywhere. And guess what? I get to observe the beauty of this planet in a leaf, you know? And I will walk across campus as well to see all our beautiful trees. But I also need community. And to tell you the truth, oftentimes I can't find the right atheist or secular community that's for me. And so I co-create it oftentimes. But what I have found as I was able to come back more into the religious world a bit is that there's a Sangha in Chinatown made up of Asian Americans. And guess what? We meditate. I'm not great about meditating by myself, but I have to do it in a group, right? But the added benefit is that social factor in that there's other Asian Americans who they're coming from Christian, Buddhist, and other backgrounds, but we all come together to meditate for that spiritual benefit and for the community. And so that really helps me stay grounded.
That's awesome. Thank you. I wanted to ask you too, was there anything else you'd like to add to the conversation that feels relevant that you haven't said?
I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I just thank you for your willingness to bring in a secular perspective, because I think there's so many young adults and adults who do think that perhaps religion and spirituality isn't for them, and yet they too can benefit from these ideas of spiritual health and practices that can serve them in the long term, but just serve them mentally, physically, and yes, spiritually.
For me, the pillar I really am attracted to personally in your framework is that of awe or transcendence. We have other secular language for purpose and relational health and some of the other things, the ethical framework, et cetera. But transcendence is kind of a spiritual idea. It's, what William James and Rudolph Aldo were talking about. In my own life, it's kind of what I chase for my own health, these peak life experiences or moments, and they're small. They're not the promotion or the big birthday party or the big trip. It's like a moment with my kids, a moment on my bike. It happens when we're no longer wearing our masks. We all wear so many masks during the day. And any given day, I'm father and husband and dean and son and friend. But who am I to myself when I take those masks off? That's when I have those moments of transcendence where I don't have to be anything to anyone. And by the way, that's where my best ideas happen about everything, when I'm not really thinking about those things. And if I don't have an ability to chase those moments, those peak life experiences, which are basically the memories we remember at the end of our life that make our life worth living. There's a bumper sticker probably outside your studio, because we're in Los Angeles and I see it everywhere. It's not how many breaths you take, but how many moments you have that take your breath away. Not how long you live, but how well you live. And those moments that take my breath away are the moments that make life worth living. And I think putting it in a spiritual health framework, like I said, offers it to people as an aspiration, as a birthright aspiration, not as nice to have, but as a core of our being sort of thing that we need to have.
An essential.
Yep.
Thank you both. Thank you for your deep insight and your wisdom. And most of all, thank you for the profound work that you do and the lives you impact, the permission you give young people and faculty and staff, and the spaces you create. I know it's a lot of work. It's countercultural. It is an act of resistance. Keep resisting. But it's not what you're resisting against as much as what you're resisting for. And love what you both are for. Thank you.
Thank you.